fearlessly defend our nation from those who seek to destroy it. From the beginning, the Democrats spied on my campaign. Remember that? They attacked me with an onslaught of fraudulent investigations. Russia, Russia, Russia. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Impeachment hoax number one. Impeachment hoax. State legislators. The millions of votes illegally stuffed into ballot boxes and all caught on government cameras. And just recently, the FBI and DOJ in collusion with Twitter and Facebook in order not to say anything bad about the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, which exposes the Biden family as criminals and which, according to the pollsters, would have made a 17-point difference in the election result. And we needed a lot less than that, like about 16.9. It would have been in our favor, not my favor, our favor, because our country is going to hell. And we remember the 51 intelligence agents who said Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. It didn't exist. It was Russian disinformation. Remember that? And that was all confirmed strongly by the FBI when they all knew that it wasn't Russian disinformation. And so much more. Our elections were like those of a third world country. And now this massive election interference at a scale never seen before in our country, beginning with the radical left, George Soros-backed prosecutor Alvin Bragg of New York, who campaigned on the fact that he would get President Trump. I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him. This is a guy campaigning. He wanted to get President Trump at any cost, and this before he knew anything about me, didn't know a thing about me. He was campaigning. As it turns out, virtually everybody that has looked at this case, including rhinos and even hardcore Democrats, say there is no crime and that it should never have been brought. Even people that aren't big fans have said it. They said this is not the right thing to do. It's an insult to our country, as the world is already laughing at us for so many other reasons, like our open borders, our incompetent withdrawal from Afghanistan, where we left behind American citizens, $85 billion worth of the best military equipment in the world, lost 13 magnificent young lives, and far too many to mention that are so badly hurt with the loss of arms and legs and facial obliteration. The most embarrassing time in our country's history, in my opinion. Then our give up on energy independence and even energy dominant. We're going to be dominant within 6 months, more than any other nation times 2. We had this all just 3 years ago. Our raging crime statistics, if you look in Democrat-run cities, numbers the likes of which we have never seen before. The open threats by various countries of the use of nuclear weapons, something never mentioned or discussed by outside nations during the Trump administration, and which could very well lead under the Biden administration's leadership to an all-out nuclear World War III can happen. We're not very far away from it, believe it or not. An economy that has been crippled by the biggest inflation we have seen in more than 60 years, and a military that I used to defeat ISIS in 4 weeks. They said it would take 4 years. 4 weeks. To kill al-Baghdadi and Soleimani, that has now gone woke at the top levels by trying to indoctrinate everyone down to the lowest ranking patriot. But now they have really stepped up their efforts by indicting the 45th president of the United States, who received 75 million votes, which is more than any sitting history of our country. And in the wings, they've got a local racist Democrat district attorney in Atlanta who is doing everything in her power to indict me over an absolutely perfect phone call, even more perfect than the one I made with the president of Ukraine. Remember, I kept saying that's a perfect call. This one was more perfect. Nobody said, sir, you shouldn't say that. Many people on the phone were hung up in disgust because of something I inappropriately said, because nothing was said wrong. In fact, at the end of the call, we agreed to continue our conversation about election fraud, specifically in Georgia, at a later time. Many people on the phone, including lots of lawyers, nobody found anything wrong with that perfect call until a book promotion tour many months later. All of a sudden they say, I remember Trump making a call. Let's look at that. This fake case was brought only to interfere with the upcoming 2024 election, and it should be dropped immediately.
And that was just an excerpt from the live footage that we've been following of Donald Trump giving a speech to his supporters at his Mar-a-Lago estate. Let me get back to you, Mr. Marklow, and excuse me for interrupting your thoughts earlier. Just for you to catch up on the question I asked about the geopolitical changes that may occur at the international arena if Trump is elected again as president.
Very, very difficult to forecast what changes Trump's re-election might actually bring to the geopolitics of a world that is already changing very, very rapidly. Certainly, when talking of Trump, the image of a bull in a china shop springs immediately to mind. So there is, without doubt, good reason and good cause to be concerned as to what new policies might be introduced and how they can impact an already very, very delicate scenario. The United States of America has lost a lot of support. The United States of America is now perceived as having failed on many fronts, is now perceived as no longer supporting other regions, is now perceived as being very, very different from how it was perceived 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So in this already very delicate situation, it does, from my very, very humble point of view, require somebody who's actually an adult to sit down with trusted advisors and to take a very, very close look at how fast international relations are changing and what the global impact of these changes actually are, and start to take some decisions, reasoning in terms of 20, 30, 40 years, reasoning in terms of where are we headed. All of this in a moment where we have a number of other concerns. If we take a look at the climate issue, absolutely dramatic, and it cannot be divorced from the world of geopolitics, and as much as climate change will bring, as the name suggests, a lot of change, which will influence relationships between different nations. We have on top of this another series of problems that have to be resolved. So now is certainly not the time to create any further disturbances or introduce any major shake-ups. Now is the time for some form of consolidation.
Very nice. And here, let me get back to you, Mr. Dennis Speed. We see during this speech that Trump was delivering, he repeated the false election claims. The former president says he has been attacked with an onslaught of investigation, and his only crime is that he defended his nation. What are your comments about this?
If Donald Trump were allowed to act as an interlocutor with President Vladimir Putin or with President Xi Jinping, you could bring a completely different element into play right now in international relations that would calm everything down. Now, he knows that. And that's why he mentioned what you heard him say about the danger of thermonuclear war. And he's trying to tell his supporters, you aren't being told about this, but I'm telling you, this kind of thing is extremely close. What he has to say about the issue of his election and what happened in that election, these are matters that were suppressed in discussion. Everybody knows about the Hunter Biden laptop as one element of that. But then there was also just the fact that the Russiagate process, remember, there were 2 impeachments of Donald Trump that were brought. An impeachment means an indictment. So what we're having happen today already happened to him twice in the presidency. And what that did was it caused the things he was doing, which involved personal relationships with leaders, heads of state, and particularly those 2 leaders who were extremely important in the world. So I believe that what we are seeing right now unfold, what he's trying to do in his response to today, is take a path that those who are intelligent should follow up on right now in terms of what the United States finds itself confronted with. And this is not a matter of, quote, interfering in the present policy. It's a matter of a former president. This used to go on all the time. Acting on behalf of the United States as a nation and the national interests of the United States, speaking with heads of state or secretaries of state or foreign ministers and so on, for the purpose of, if you will, ameliorating or smoothing over or dialoguing with persons that you believe to be your enemies. If we can't do that, how can the United States claim to be a leading nation in the world?
Very nice indeed. Mr. Dennis Speed, political analyst and founding member of Scheller Institute. You were with us live from New Jersey. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And as mentioned earlier, Finland joining European military alliance makes NATO's border bigger. We will discuss the repercussions of these shortly after this. As NATO military alliance confirmed Finland's accession, Moscow promised that the relations between the 2 nations will change according to Russia's security interests and that Moscow won't hesitate to take any countermeasures to ensure the safety of Russian population. Here's Sofian Kinturi.
Kremlin said on Tuesday it would be obliged to take countermeasures to ensure Russia's security in response to Finland's accession to NATO military alliance. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called Helsinki's move to join NATO a threat to Moscow's security due to the European hostile structure towards Russia lately.
The enlargement of NATO is a threat to Russia's security and its national interests. We've talked about this. That's how we see this. And of course, it makes us take countermeasures to provide for our own security, tactically and strategically.
For its part, Russia's foreign ministry said Finland was committing dangerous historical mistake that would fray relations with Moscow and undo its status as confidence-building presence in the Baltic Sea and Europe at large.
This is now a thing of the past. Finland has become one of the small members of NATO that doesn't decide anything, losing its special voice in international affairs. We're sure that history will judge this hasty step.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in an interview published on Tuesday, the European Union has become hostile and has lost Russia, and Moscow will deal with Europe in a tough fashion if it's necessary.
The European Union has lost Russia, but it's its own fault. It is the EU member countries and EU leaders who openly declare it is necessary to inflict, as they call it, a strategic defeat on Russia.
Finland's accession, ending 7 decades of military no-alignment, roughly doubles the length of border that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization shares with Russia and bolster its eastern flank as the war in Ukraine grinds on with no resolution in sight.
And to enrich the debate even further, joining me live is Eugene Chosovsky, Senior Director in Analytical Development and Training at New Lines Institute. Mr. Eugene, thank you ever so much for agreeing to be with us. And my first question is, the NATO military alliance just got bigger as Finland has become its 31st member. What will change according to you, Mr. Eugene?
Well, I think in the immediate term, there's not going to be any major changes. This was an accession process that started shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think this was widely expected. It had to go through some bureaucratic hurdles, and now the accession is finally complete. Certainly symbolically, this adds to the contention between Russia and NATO, particularly over Ukraine, but we've seen that spill over in other territories. Now, this could actually change things on the ground depending on if there is going to be an increase in NATO assets and weaponry that goes to Finland. The Russians have alluded to this already, but for the time being, I don't see this actually impacting too much on the ground, at least in the near term.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Marklow, NATO's borders with Russia expanded by 1,300 kilometers, and Russia is vowing countermeasures. What are we expecting to unfold after this, Mr. Marklow?
To be quite frank, I don't expect anything to happen in the immediate term. A lot of statements, a lot of noise, a lot of ridiculous comments. I'm talking of comments and statements that are coming out of Moscow. So for the time being, what is Russia going to do? Russia, at this precise moment in time, isn't going to do anything at all other than release via Lavrov, release via Putin's spokespersons, release via ministers and deputy ministers a series of words. At the end of the day, Putin has achieved the absolute opposite of his original intention. NATO has become stronger. NATO has become larger. NATO hasn't fractured. It hasn't imploded. It hasn't fallen to pieces. It's actually become stronger. Now, none of us would have liked that. None of us would have liked to find ourselves in the scenario that we're living in today. But here we are, and we have to be very, very realistic from a very pragmatic point of view. And please forgive the turn of phrase, but I mean, Russia has enough problems to deal with at the current moment, and it's currently being anything other than successful in resolving these problems. So any extension, any escalation, any opening of new fronts would seem extremely unlikely at best. So for the time being, all I expect from the Russian side are a series of statements and threats and just a lot of hot air, basically.
Clear. And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, the war in Ukraine prompted Finland's application. But what does this mean to the war in Ukraine? Did things get too complicated to resolve now?
Well, being a military veteran and having served in 2 combat tours, I can assure you that there are objectives that are often not talked about. I think that President Vladimir Putin is not just operating at the tactical level where you're seeing the war unfold, the population being impacted, the buildings being destroyed, the bombings, but also what's happening geopolitically. What has President Putin gained today? He has become the czar of the East. How do we know that? We're looking at new trade relations between Russia and Iran. These are record conversations that have not been fully understood, but that definitely means there's a big change happening. Look at what's happening between Russia and OPEC. Look at what's happening between Russia, China, and India. Russia is now having more influence within the supply chain hubs, which means that what we witnessed during COVID as far as the supply chain impact, Russia is now targeting the key supply chain hubs and is revamping its trade relations, its bilateral relations between military states, and that is a bigger objective than just the Ukraine invasion. So I think we need to look at this in terms of a strategic approach, because President Vladimir Putin is playing a much different gamble, and his last big game is to attack the US dollar, and now this is a new announcement, and we've got to keep track of all the strategic goals, not just the tactical level invasion.
And Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, some see that Finland's membership is not complete without Sweden. Neighboring Sweden, which had avoided military alliances for more than 200 years, is being stalled by objections from NATO members Turkey and Hungary. How do you see this unfolding, Mr. Eugene?
Well, certainly Sweden and Finland's NATO bid, which came together, we've now seen Finland complete that accession. And as you mentioned, Sweden is further behind due to internal disagreements, particularly with Turkey. But I think that in general, both Sweden and Finland have a lot of interoperability with NATO forces in terms of their weapons, their assets, and even training that will make that accession whenever it happens, a relatively smooth one. And I think we've seen that in the case of Finland as well. So, we do have politics playing out in the meantime, but from a broader strategic perspective, what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done has really unified NATO countries and countries like Sweden and Finland around the common threat of Russia. But yes, of course, there will always be minor issues to deal with in the meantime, but from the strategic sense, I think that is moving in the direction of continued solidarity, both within NATO and with Ukraine as well.
Back to you, Mr. Mark Lowe. Analysts say that Finland's inclusion in the NATO is a strategic setback, just like Mr. Adam Roosevelt referred to it earlier. So can you explain to us how is this really a strategic setback for Russia, and what can you clarify more about this point in general?
Okay, if I can just clarify one thing first and foremost. My previous comments were as an answer to your specific question regarding Finland's entry into NATO. I say this because I want to follow up by saying that absolutely everything that Dr. Roosevelt said, I agree with entirely, 100%. We have to look at the far, far bigger picture, and here we go back to the comments made during the transmission earlier on when we talked in terms of an eventual second Trump presidency. What will that mean for international relations, etc.? So as I said, I agree absolutely 100%. We are in the midst of a complete change to the world order. We're looking at a new world order directly in the face. And in this new world order, Russia has done very, very well in creating a new role for itself. But going back specifically to the issue of Finland joining NATO, what can I say? NATO now has 31 members. It's bigger, it's stronger. I don't, in all honesty, really have anything else to say. It's a demonstration of the fear that exists amongst NATO members. It's a demonstration of the fear, and I think this is very important, that exists amongst European citizens, and this specifically in regards to Russia's potential and ambitions. If the Finns, who historically have always been against joining NATO, have always been non-aligned, if the recent polls can be trusted, then we have somewhere in the region of 80%, 80% of Finns approving membership of NATO. This is very, very significant.
Yes, and Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, experts have described Finland's NATO inclusion as a significant moment for European security. And hence we deduce that countries which are neutral obviously can't remain so in today's Europe. What is your comment, Mr. Eugene?
Well, I think certainly countries that are on the front lines of the war in Ukraine, on the front lines of NATO, feel a certain amount of pressure that they can't remain neutral. It's been mentioned before, but public opinion, both within Finland and Sweden, on joining NATO was actually quite low overall until Russia's full-scale invasion, and then that changed dramatically, which really showed that neutrality in this case was not seen as an option. But having said that, I agree with the previous speakers that certainly outside of the West, there are countries that don't necessarily fall in the pro-Russian or the pro-Western camp. And a lot of them have already been mentioned, countries like China, India, the Gulf states, Turkey. So these countries, perhaps not neutral, but they don't fall completely one way or the other. And this is part of an emerging world order that I think is important outside of the immediate European security context.
And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, neutral European states support sanctions for Russia, but oppose direct involvement in the war. Is it possible to remain neutral in today's Europe, Adam Roosevelt, or has that ship long sailed?
Well, I think this is a very complex conversation in regards to sanctions, as you very well probably all would agree that the complexities of sanctions, understanding who the ultimate beneficiaries are from a corporate perspective, being able to leverage intelligence tools to identify what Russians are tied in with different organizations and entities. The labyrinth is very, very complex. The Department of Justice, the CIA, the FBI, NSA, all are looking at trying to unravel this network that is very, very massive, very clever, and understands how to leverage the financial system better than most of the traditional bankers. So I would say it's not simply a sanctions conversation. It is unraveling the sanctions network, understanding how weapons deals are being done, how investments are being done, strategic investments, mergers and acquisitions, even from the Committee of Foreign Intelligence. We've got so many different elements that are not being discussed. So I think the Russians, I think certain nations who have been sanctioned have adapted to the U.S. and NATO in anticipation that sanctions will be leveraged against them. And they are now using even the crypto market to avoid these particular sanctions. And it's getting very complex for the existing investigators.
And Mr. Mark Lowe, countries such as Switzerland, Austria, Malta, and Ireland are debating their neutral stance. Do you feel these countries are indeed being pressured to change their stance?
Well, there's an element of being pressured, and there's an element of a feeling that a decision has to be made. These are small countries. These are countries that in certain cases have done very, very well for themselves. Look at Ireland, look at Switzerland. But they remain very small and on the world stage, fairly insignificant countries. They are countries that provide services for others. The Swiss via the financial systems, the banking system, the Republic of Ireland through having had the ability to create a technological hub and a services hub halfway between Europe and the United States of America. But one way or another, there has to be some form of alignment. A small country has to align itself with, in these days, a small country has to align itself with one bloc or with another. So that, if you like, is a form of inherent pressure, basically.
And back to you, Mr. Eugene Chosovsky. Can any of these neutral European countries act as mediators whatsoever in this conflict?
Well, we've seen different attempts at mediation, but I think that any country that is certainly within the EU or any country that's sanctioned Russia within the EU or NATO basically is not going to be able to serve as an effective mediator. The one exception that we've seen has been Turkey, which is a NATO member, but it has not pursued sanctions against Russia. So I think from a European perspective, it's unlikely. We saw attempts by both France and Germany to play mediating roles before this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but prior to the 2014 period. That obviously ended up not working out, and we've seen the escalation since then. More likely, we're going to see non-Western, non-European countries play mediating roles. I've mentioned Turkey before, but even some of the Gulf states, and we've seen China attempt to do so. It's going to be very difficult, but I think that any mediating country has to have a degree of a relationship with both Russia and with Ukraine. So that, I think, inherently disqualifies, in a sense, a lot of European countries from playing a mediating role.
Clear indeed. And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, any comment regarding that?
Well, I think I would advocate for the obvious choice, which often is not put forward, and I believe that the United Arab Emirates would be a very strong mediator. So we have the UAE as an option. We have, from a Western perspective, we would not tend to submit this recommendation, but China is also playing a vital role in playing a mediator. So we have to determine who is the preferred option. If we go with China, we know that China is a strategic investor. It has so many different things to benefit from its Belt and Road Initiative strategy, and this would play a major benefit toward them. But I think the UAE could play a larger role given what they've been able to accomplish, but some may argue against that position given the blacklist currently.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Mark Lowe, any final words?
Yeah, just raising the issue of sanctions. We've seen once again that in reality our sanctions are anything other than efficient. We've seen once again that those that suffer the most from sanctions are actually, I'm speaking from Europe, so I will talk specifically about the European reality, European countries. So it's also a case for, at a certain point, stopping, taking a very close look at how sanctions are imposed, how they actually work, what level of efficiency they have, learning a few very, very important lessons, and thinking very, very carefully in the future in regards to introducing sanctions on countries such as, in this case, we're speaking specifically about Russia, but on any other country. Who, at the end of the day, suffers from what I see at the moment? Those that are suffering the most from these several rounds of sanctions against Russia are actually the European countries rather than Russian interests. So that's another issue for another day. But what we have seen over the past year has very, very much taught us the lesson that sanctions at the end of the day are, yes, of course, they're very, very technical. It's very, very hard to identify against whom, against which organizations. That's very, very difficult. It takes up a lot of time. But we've seen that in any case, they simply are not efficient. And therefore, as a tool, are they still a viable option? Questions that a lot of governments are going to have to ask themselves in the near future.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much, Mr. Mark Lowe, Adam Roosevelt, Dennis Spade, and Eugene Chasovsky. Thank you, our guests, for all your insightful analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on our channel. Till next time, take care.